So there are three major types of checkmates that you need to know before you even start playing a full game, right? The first one is going to be the king and two rooks versus versus a king. And the second one is going to be the king and queen, right, versus a king. Then the last one is going to be the king and rook versus the king. Now, this is not the only kind of endgame checkmates that we have. We have others like the king and bishop and knight, but this is not for, let's say, the beginner level right now. So the major ones that you need to know as a beginner is these three that I mentioned. And today we're going to be looking at one of them, which is the king and the rook, right? This is one of the most, I think it's the most difficult among the three. It's not very difficult though, but it's the most difficult among the three. And a lot of people find it very difficult to do a checkmate with this kind of position. So firstly, before we even look into it, I'm going to explain one thing that you're going to be using in order to get in order to eventually resolve into a checkmate position. And the first thing that you need to take note of is opposition. And what is opposition? Opposition is when your king and your opponent's king are directly facing each other. Like in this position, we have the king on d1, and we also have our opponent's king on the black king on d3, right? So you can see they're facing each other with one square in between, right? So this is an example of an opposition. Now, an opposition can happen in this way. It can also happen, let's say, this way, right? You can see both of the kings are still facing each other, but this time around it's sideways, right? And there's still one square in between, right? Remember, the kings can never meet at any point. This is not going to happen ever at all. And if it happens in a real game, you can pause the clock and then call on the attention of the arbiter if you're playing in a real tournament. If you're playing against, let's say, computer, or if you're playing an online game, you can't, this move is not going to even be part of the moves that you can play. So you're safe. So the kings can never meet, right? And whenever this is the closest they can get, and this is called an opposition. So you can also have an opposition this way, you can have an opposition this way, and we started off this way, right? So you can see you can't call this an opposition. This is not an opposition. I know you're going to say, okay, but this is one square in between, right? So this is sideways. We want it to be either in a vertical or in a horizontal, like in a cross shape, something like that. So this is how you can get the opposition if, let's say, the king is around here. So either here, right, you can see the kings are facing. This is not an opposition, right, because this is diagonal. This is an opposition because they're facing each other and it's just one square. This is not an opposition, say, because it's diagonal. This is an opposition and this is not an opposition. Now, for a checkmate of a king and rook to happen, this is the exact position that you have to get into. Not exact though, but almost like this. You have to resolve into this position, right? Let's say white is having to do a checkmate, and then there's a rook. Now you can see this is a direct attack on the king check, and this is an opposition. So whenever there's an opposition and the opponent is on a check, he either has to move backwards, or in this case, this is going to be a checkmate because all the possible squares for the king is under attack by either one or two of our pieces. Like right now, the rook is controlling this whole line, so the king can't step foot on any of these squares, right? And our king is also controlling this three squares, so it's not going to be possible. There's no square for black's king to move to, and this is a checkmate. You can still have the same kind of checkmate in this kind of position, right? This is a check, and let's say this. So it always happens with an opposition, but the opposition has to be when the king is at the edge of the board, right? So so lastly, you can still have a checkmate this way, right? Now I'm going to set up an example, and you can pause and just try to find the best move in each of the positions. So Now, let's say you had a rook here and this was the position, right? This was the position. There's a checkmate in one. You can see we are already in the opposition that we talked about, and all you need to do as white is to just do a check that will result into a checkmate. So you can pause and try to find the best move. Now, if you pause and you found the right move, you're going to see that your answer was rook to h7. This is going to be a checkmate because this is a direct attack on the king, and right now the king is on an opposition. All right, I'm going to set another example. So let's say black's king was this way and we had something like this. What is going to be the checkmate in one? Right, so rook to d1 is going to be a checkmate because right now the king is still in an opposition like we said. So if rook goes to d1, this is a check and the king can't move up because of the opposition. So you can see this is this is usually the final move that results into a checkmate in the king and rook checkmate, right? So this is not the hardest part. This is, should I say, the easiest part. We're coming to the hardest part here. All right. So now the major problem, right, that a lot of players usually encounter is getting to the king, right? We know that, So we know that the king needs to be at the edge of the board, right? But the question is, how can we get the king to the edge of the board right now? Okay, so I'm going to give you a tip, right? When the king is in an opposition, even if it's not at the edge of the board, right? If you can place a check, right? Now you can see the king can't move forward, right? And you're controlling this rank, the third rank. So what your opponent has no choice but to move backwards, and that's the major aim, right? Now, when you're trying to do a checkmate with the rook, right? You're majorly looking at trying to create a cage and eventually limiting your opponent's squares to a particular point where he has no moves at all, right? So whenever you're in opposition, right, and it's your turn to play, right, you should always do a check, and this pushes your opponent backwards. And if, let's say, something like this happens and the king moves, okay, sorry. So after this check, if something like this happens, right, and you move forward and the king goes to d4, you can still place another check. And you can see the king has to move backwards, right? So whenever the king is in an opposition, right, you can deliver a check and it helps you accomplish your plan way faster. Although they're not going to make it as easy as this, right? It's going to be a little bit more complicated than this. So now that you've fully understood what opposition is, right? Now we're going to look at how to do the checkmate. Now let's assume this was the starting position with the king and the rook, right? The first thing that you want to look at is whenever you're doing a checkmate, your aim is to try and get the king, right, to the edge of the board, right? These are the four edges of the board. So any of this side will be okay, right? Now, firstly, like I said, you want to create a cage, right? Now, we're going to place the rook here, and what does placing the rook here does, right? The king is attacking the rook, but the king can't capture. Now, why is that? Because we have our king protecting, right? So now this rook is controlling the e file and the second rank. So this is the cage right now we have on black's king. So the squares that are not highlighted are all the squares the black's king can move into, right? And our plan is to eventually shrink this cage to a point whereby he is finally at the edge of the board, and you're going to see. So right now it's black's turn to play, and let's say black decides to play this move, right? Now you want to get into opposition, right? Either by going forward or better still by going here, right? And now if you go here, it's still okay because if he moves this way, now this is the cage that you have. You can see the cage this was the cage, but now you've increased the, let's say, the cage, or you've shrink the cage now, and this is the amount of squares he has now, right? So let's say after going here, he comes here, right? Now, what you want to do is you want to move the rook in such a way that it's going to limit the amount of squares that he can move to. Now, a lot of mistakes players make is in this kind of position, they try to do a check, and you're going to see that you're at the end of the day just probably going back to square one, because now you've given him like an escape, right? You're still winning in this position, but now it's going to take much more time, much more longer time. So instead of going check over here, right, the best move right now to do actually is to just play a waiting move, right? Just go behind the rook with the king, and whenever he moves back, you can now move forward with the king. And let's say he moves to the side, you bring your rook. If he comes here, right, still do the same thing, move the king to e3, right, with the idea if he moves either here, you lock in, you increase the cage that you wanted, right? If he doesn't go here, let's assume he moves backwards instead to d6. What are you going to do? You're going to move your king forward, and you can see we're slowly pushing the king away to the edge of the board. If he moves this way, what are we going to do? We're going to bring our rook forward, and now you can see how the cage that started from this way, right? This was where the rook was. Now this is what we have. So the king no longer have all these squares at its disposal. These are the only squares now the king can move to, and we're going to keep on reducing the squares that the king can move to. So right now, if the king moves here, remember, just go back to e4, and it's probably going to go here, then shrink the squares, right? So let's say he moves here eventually, right? You just try to bring your king closer, right? And if he moves this way, what happens? You lock in the king. And you can see how the king squares are becoming a little bit tighter, right? Whenever okay, so this is where it becomes critical, right? Whenever the king gets to the edge of the board, what is the first thing that you should think of? The first thing that you should think of is, how can which move can I play that will fully lock the king on the edge of the board, right? Now, remember, the rooks move in a cross shape, right? So the rook over here controls all of these squares, right? And now this rook stops this king from ever having, let's say, any thought of moving out, right? The king can't capture the rook because our king is protecting, can't move here or here because, what's the name? The rook is attacking this whole file, the b file. And the only option for the king is this way. And whenever you have something like this, right, just take the king, the rook as far away as possible from the king. An important note, it should be behind your king, right? You want to eventually get into an opposition and then do a check, right? If you take the rook instead, okay, there's no actually good square. Any square that you decide to drop the rook forward is going to be captured. But we go back here, and now you try to look for an opposition. Remember, if you recall, what is an opposition, or what does an opposition look like? It's when the kings are facing each other. So he will probably be moving something like this. You move forward, he comes here, you move forward, right? And he goes here, you move forward, and then finally you get into the opposition. And what is going to be the final move for you to play? It's just this, right? Now, I'm going to also set up an exercise just to confirm if you have an idea of what we're looking at. Now, in this position, right, in this position, just assume it was white to play. Now, there's one single move that you can play that will reduce the stress of having to, let's say, take a lot of time to do a checkmate. Remember, I made a statement. When the king is on the edge of the board, what are you going to look at? Look for a move that traps the king completely at the edge of the board. That is what you're supposed to be looking at. And if you find it, or if you look at it carefully, you're going to see that rook to g1 is going to be the best move. So if rook goes to g1, you can see the king is now trapped at the edge of the board, the H file to be precise. And now all you need to do is just to move the king forward and eventually get an opposition. Now, another thing you need to take note of is when you're looking for an opposition, right? When the king is at the edge of the board, right? You want it to be your turn. Okay, for example, right now, if you go here, if king goes to f4, this is not going to be a checkmate immediately. Why is that? Because if he moves here, this is not an opposition, right? If you do a check, he can move out and run away, right? So instead of going to f4 right here in this position, right? Instead of moving here, you can actually just move this way with the idea that, okay, if he moves up, now it's your turn to play and you're in the opposition, so you can do a check, right? And if he doesn't go there, if he tries to attack your rook, you just keep on following the king. When he attacks, you move away. And he's probably going to play something like this. Remember, when you play something like this, you don't want to look at or get into the opposition yourself, right? What you want to do is you want to play just a waiting move. You want him, rather, not you. You want him to get into the opposition. And after this, if he decides to go here, it's just going to be a checkmate. So he's probably going to see that and maybe run to h2. And after h2, you just keep on following. If the king goes to h1, you keep on following. And if the king goes to h2, you then deliver your checkmate, right? So it's not very hard. Now, remember, whenever you have an opportunity to lock the king on the edge of the board, you just lock the king, right? So if the king is over here, can you find the best move that white can play? What should white play in this position? What move locks the king completely on the edge of the board? You're going to find out that the best move is going to be rook to g7. Rook to g7 locks the king completely, and all you need to do now is to move your king forward into an opposition, right? And then you get the checkmate. So for example, if the king goes here, you move forward. If he goes here, you move forward. If he goes here, you need to be careful. Whenever the king gets close to the rook, you can see the rook is on the attack right now. So move your rook away to safety. And if the king goes here, now instead of going straight up one opposition, you know that he's trying to probably chase your rook, right? He's trying to chase your rook and capture. So instead of going straight up, you can go towards your rook. And if he decides to, let's say, get close to your rook, this is going to be a checkmate, rook a8, right? So but if he decides to move this way instead, you just keep on closing in. Eventually, he's going to be forced to get into the opposition, and then this is now going to be a checkmate, right? So this is simply how you checkmate with the king and the rook, right? This is how you checkmate with the king and the rook. Okay, so I'm going to set the position back from the beginning, and I'm just going to do the checkmate. Now, firstly, we played this, and the idea was to set up a cage for the king. Whenever the king moves backward, right, upwards, you move forward with your king. If the king moves sideways, you try and close in with your rook instead, right? So let's say the king moved here, you move forward, and he goes here. Now, what do you want to do? You want to keep on increasing the cage, right? So you're going to go here, right? Rook to e3, and this is what you have. He attacks your rook, but no need to worry. Your king is protecting. Now, all you need to do is to still protect the rook. You have to move your king right now in this position. And the only move that doesn't lose your rook is king to e2. Any other move, king back, loses the rook. He just capture and it becomes a draw, right? If you go here, he still captures. He still captures. If you go, let's say here, he still captures. So the only move that doesn't lose the rook is going here. And when you go here, he moves away. What are you going to do? Remember, if you move sideways, you just close in with your rook, right? And if he moves, okay, yeah, so if he moves up, you just try to get your king close as possible, right? And then if he moves up, then you go right away here. He tries to move sideways, then you close in with your rook. Well, let's say he moves up, you keep on just moving up with your king. If he keeps on going backwards, this is just going to be easy for you, right? So right now, maybe he keeps on going here. Already in this position, he has gotten himself to the edge of the board. And right here, instead of even, if he goes here, instead of going straight up to this square, you can actually go here. And if you look closely, you're going to see that this rook is controlling the d file, right? And the king is right almost where we want the king to be. So now his king can't move anywhere. The king can't move to d8. The king can't move to d7, can't move to c7 also, right? The king can't move here. The king is only forced to with one move, and this gets the king into an opposition. And right here, you're going to see that this is going to be a checkmate, right? So another major thing that you need to take note of is sometimes you can have this kinds of position, right? This kind of position whereby you have a rook here. Just look at this position for a minute or some seconds and try and ask yourself what possible squares can black king move to right now. You're going to find out there's only one, which is getting into the opposition, and then you eventually deliver a checkmate, right? So all you need to do now, if it's your turn to play, is just to move the rook along the same rank. And he's going to have to move this way. If you move the rook out of the rank, right, you're giving him chance to run away. So if you have this kind of position, you can just play a waiting move, a simple move, and if he eventually goes here, this is the only move that he has. This is called a forced move, right? Then you eventually do a checkmate. It can also happen this way, right? Let's say you have the king this way and then there's a rook here. What can you see? The king is already at the edge of the board and he can't move also to any of these squares. This is the only square he can move to. And if he goes to e1, then rook c1 is going to be a checkmate, right? So same thing on this side. Whenever you're having this kind of position, just move backwards and this is going to eventually be a checkmate. So these are the major things that you need to take note when you're doing the king and rook checkmate. Firstly, the major thing that you need to take note of is opposition. With the king and the rook checkmate, you need the help of the king. You can't do a checkmate alone with the rook, right? You need the help of the king and you need to always try and oppose your opponent's king, right? So then secondly, whenever you have an opportunity to trap the king at the edge of the board, you should do it without any hesitation, right? So, and then lastly, when trying to get the king to the edge of the board, the king moves backwards, right, upwards or downwards, right? You want to just move your king. If he moves to the side, either left or right, you try to get your rook also either left or right, depending on how the position is. Right now, he can't move towards the right-hand side, so he can only move towards the left, and we can do this, and we're closing in, right? You should always take note of the cage, right? You should always, okay, ask yourself, what is the cage like now? The move that I'm planning on making, is it actually going to like open up the cage, or is it closing in the king, right? Because that's what we want. And eventually you're going to, yeah, so with few practice, you're going to get a hang of it. the best way to practice this, you can just set up a position on leeches, right? And you must make sure that the king is not under attack. If you set up the position this way, it's not going to work, right? Because the king is under attack right now. So so it has to be a square that is not being attacked. And then you click continue from here. You play against the computer, select the hardest level. You want to be white because you're the one with the rook. If you set up the position with black, having the rook, you're going to click on black because you want to be black. And then you practice the position. You should try and practice it like 5 times. And once you practice it like 5 times, you're going to see that you've gotten the hang of it and it's going to be very, very easy. Okay. So thank you for watching till the end. If you watched to the end, I want to say a very big congratulations because you definitely know by now you should have mastered the king and the rook checkmate. So all you need is just a little bit of practice. So see you in our next video. Thank you.